I'm Terry Haynes, Project Coordinator for Mental Health Programs at ESU 13. I'll be speaking to the signs of trauma. Teachers, school psychologists, counselors, social workers, and building administrators have long been on the front lines of engaging students with mental health needs. These needs are vast. In fact, 1 in 6 youths aged 6 through 17 experience a mental health disorder each year. Given the amount of time children and adolescents spend at school, educators are often the first point of contact regarding mental illness. Familiarizing our educators with mental wellness terms and techniques help us all to better understand ourselves and our students. We will begin with Section 1, the signs and symptoms of trauma. While there are numerous definitions of trauma, for the purpose of this training, we will discuss trauma according to the following definition. Individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Now, delving further into the concept of trauma, there are distinct categories to consider. Acute or single event trauma, repeated events or chronic trauma, complex or historical trauma, and secondary or vicarious trauma. A single event or acute trauma is a single traumatic event that is sudden or unexpected. For example, witnessing a serious traffic accident or a house fire, or natural disaster, or a terrorist attack would each be an instance of causing a single event trauma. Chronic trauma occurs when traumatic events are repeated or ongoing, which may be experienced by a single person or group. So for example, ongoing sexual abuse, the death of a loved one, or living in a war zone or a violent neighborhood can all be situations that lead to chronic trauma. Complex trauma includes exposure to ongoing or recurrent exposure to interpersonal trauma. This typically occurs within a caregiving system that is supposed to be safe and stable. Complex trauma or historical trauma is experienced over time and across generations by a group of people who share an identity, affiliation, or circumstance. Some examples of historical events that can be trauma-inducing may include colonization, enslavement, racism, discrimination, disease, removal of children from families, systemic destruction or persecution of their identity, cultural and spiritual practices, etc. Historical trauma can be simultaneous with all or some of the other categories of trauma. Secondary or vicarious trauma is when a person is exposed to someone else's trauma or details of a traumatic event, often as part of your job role. First responders are an example of this. The prevalence of traumatic events is high, with approximately 62% of adolescents ages 13 to 17 years old reporting having had exposure to at least one potentially traumatic event. According to the Center for Disease Control, at least 1 in 7 children in the U.S. have experienced abuse or neglect in the past year. Approximately 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 20 boys in the U.S. experience sexual abuse. 1.4 million people are treated for assault in emergency departments every year. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are potentially traumatic events that occur during childhood, and about 64% of adults in the U.S. reported experiencing at least one ACE prior to turning 18. The lifetime prevalence of PTSD in adults is between 6 and 8%. About 25% of children exposed to trauma develop PTSD. So let's review ACEs in this video.
Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs as they're known, are potentially traumatic events that occur during childhood that have an impact, a negative impact on young people's sense of safety and security and stability.
So when we think about things such as abuse or neglect or circumstances that have happened in a household, such as a parent being incarcerated or a parent who has who's abusing substances.
It could be things in the broader environment of the young person. So for example, growing up in a household that has mental illness or separation from parents, for example, through incarceration or being moved to a different family environment. It can also be even broader environmental factors. So for example, things like racism, discrimination, poverty, food insecurity or housing insecurity are all under the umbrella of ACEs. And what we know is that when students experience adverse childhood experiences, they are at much greater risk of chronic health problems as adults, as well as other disruptions to their ability to function in their daily lives and into adulthood. The good news is that ACEs are not only preventable, but once they occur, there are things that we can do to mitigate the negative impact of them. And educators are absolutely critical to both of those, both the prevention of ACEs, but also to addressing the potentially negative impact of those. So one thing we know is that having a positive adult in young people's lives is one of the best buffers against ACEs. We know that when students are able to form positive attachments with their teachers, they are much less likely to experience the negative impacts of ACEs. We also know that when students are able to foster social emotional competencies, they are less likely to experience some of the negative impacts of ACEs. So again, teachers are absolutely essential to supporting young people who have experienced adversity and can make a world of difference in their outcomes.
Trauma is not just psychological. It affects the body and the brain as well. Let's look at some brain science in this next video.
Trauma has a significant impact on the brain. Trauma literally changes the shape and function of the brain. And so when we experience a really stressful event, there's stress hormones that are released. And so those hormones are having an impact on certain areas of the brain. And so we see that for students who have experienced trauma, that there are more difficulties with concentration, with sometimes language development, sometimes there are IQ delays. And so when we think about that in the context of school, students who have experienced significant trauma may have greater difficulty in school. They may exhibit certain behaviors that may cause difficulty and challenges in the classroom. And so oftentimes, unfortunately, those students are disciplined harshly because of some behaviors, and school staff may not have an awareness that there was a traumatic experience or even know how to appropriately support that student. So it is really important for educators to be aware of trauma and the impact that it can have on behavior and learning.
We know that for our students, when they've experienced something traumatic, it can impact the brain directly. We know, for example, that when someone experiences a traumatic event, it turns up what we call the emotional center of their brain, or the survival part of their brain, which has to do with something called the amygdala. And it essentially sets off alarms. So it puts us into what we think of as a fight, flight, or freeze response. And that's natural. It's our way of protecting ourselves. The difficulty comes that when young people have experienced severe or chronic trauma, the survival part of their brain turns up in situations where it doesn't need to, and it can make them less able to function in a positive way in their environment. The other thing that trauma does in the brain is it turns down what we call the thinking part of the brain, and that's your prefrontal cortex, your hippocampus that is responsible for creating potent memories of events. And we see that when young people have experienced trauma, that part of their brain stops working as well. And you can imagine in the school environment, when the thinking part of your brain is compromised, it makes it very difficult for students to access the learning environment. It makes it more difficult to concentrate, to organize, to plan. And so it's really important that we pay attention to the negative impact on brain architecture of trauma.
Trauma turns a learning brain into a surviving brain. Our brain and body are hardwired to respond to trauma using a fight, flight, or freeze response. These actions, fight, flight, or freeze, are not something done consciously. It's an innate reaction that occurs when our brain or body thinks we are in danger and our alarm system is activated. We adapted these reactions to help keep us safe. Often, people do not realize or recognize that this is happening to them, and when we are in the stress response of fight, flight, or freeze, the parts of our brain that are involved in executive functioning or higher level thinking, like problem solving, are shut down or much harder to use because the prefrontal cortex essentially gets unplugged. When activated, this stress response can make learning especially difficult. Imagine trying to take a math test while a fire alarm is going off. Such a situation would be frustrating and a distraction, and the individual would certainly perform less than their best. Intrusive trauma symptoms are symptoms related to the traumatic event being re-experienced in some way. These might include upsetting memories, nightmares, flashbacks, or reactivity. Exposure to trauma reminders may trigger such things as an increase in heart rate, feeling scared, or difficulty in breathing when the individual finds themselves with certain people, places, things, or situations. Avoidance symptoms are present when a person is attempting to avoid trauma-related thoughts, feelings, or reminders. This could look like someone pushing away thoughts of the event and intentionally trying to avoid recalling it. It also might present as avoidance of trauma-related reminders in the real world, such as keeping a distance from certain people, places, or things that remind the person of trauma. Mood changes due to negative thoughts or feelings connected with the trauma may begin or worsen over time if left unaddressed. Negative thoughts are characteristic in such instances, as the individual may ruminate on ideas like, "It's my fault this happened," or "the world is really unsafe." Learning to recognize trauma as a legitimate psychological response to an overwhelming experience is an important skill for anyone to develop. This video will further explain.
One of my children, she and her brother were homeless. She went from coming to school on time every day to get, like, our school starts at 8 o'clock, to coming at 10 o'clock in the morning. We're supposed to be teachers and, we go to school for education, but we're so much more than that. We're social workers, we're moms, we're dads, we're, sisters sometime, I was able to hook them into the school social workers so that they can get transportation services. You really, really need to pay attention to patterns, and changes in patterns.
So I have a student that I actually am still in contact with who her mother had just come back into her life. I could tell it threw things off for her. Her grades were falling. The mother had a drug dependency. So you can tell that it was affecting her schoolwork. She is a student that always participates, so it was affecting her emotionally. I had to pull her aside and sit down one-on-one and try to figure out what the issue was that was affecting her so that we can help her.
Symptoms that may be noticeable by others following exposure to a traumatic experience include changes in arousal or reactivity symptoms like hypervigilance, always on the edge and alert. They may have a heightened startle response or begin to engage in unhealthy or risky behavior. The individual may display irritability, anger, or acts of aggression. Alternatively, they may seem depressed, exhibiting a low mood, withdrawing from others, and not wanting to hang out with or talk to family or friends. They may have a hard time enjoying the things they used to do, and changes in sleep and/or appetite can be noticeable. For kids, this often presents as behavior concerns like tantrums, or can present similar to the characteristics of ADHD. They may have a more difficult time concentrating or focusing, Trauma responses can vary widely among individuals and may manifest differently depending on various factors. Let's look at an example that illustrates a possible scenario.
Hello, my name is Jessica Christensen, and I am a regional trainer with the Mid-America Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. Today, I'm going to present you some scenarios for how trauma could show up in your classroom. For each scenario, I will read the scenario, give you some questions to think about, and then give an explanation of the scenario. Please remember that these scenarios are not exhaustive and that trauma can show up in many different ways in your classroom. So with that being said, here's scenario 1. Caleb, a 7th grade student, comes into your first period classroom every morning with his head down, hood up, and wearing headphones. He quietly walks to the back of the room and immediately puts his head down on the desk. When you ask him to raise his head and take off his headphones and hood, he immediately becomes angry and begins yelling at you. You respond firmly and loudly, reminding Caleb of the school's expectations for no hoods and no headphones. You also remind Caleb that he does this every day, and if he does not change his behaviors, he won't pass the class. Caleb angrily stands up, shoves his desk to the side, and leaves the classroom. Here are some things to think about. What behaviors is Caleb exhibiting? How does this direct approach affect Caleb? What are the needs of Caleb, and how are they being met in this scenario? Trauma can often show up in quiet and withdrawn behaviors. Students who seem to be quietly flying under the radar can be trying to stay hidden and quiet to avoid being seen and possibly evoking an angry response from an adult. When they are called out in front of their peers, their fight or flight response is activated and they will respond by either leaving, lashing out, or in this case, both. One way to approach Caleb through a trauma-sensitive lens is to begin class as normal and then talk to Caleb quietly on his own. Ask him if he's okay. Ask him if he needs anything. Think about allowing certain protective factors for Caleb, like allowing his hood to stay on, if his headphones come off. Think about what needs Caleb needs to be filled, and how are you going to do that in a way that allows him to continue to feel both psychologically and physically safe.
Feeling physically, socially, or emotionally unsafe may cause extreme anxiety in a person who has experienced trauma. There are many techniques for creating safe and supportive environments that promote healing and resilience. Educators may already be using them in the school setting without even realizing it. For example, educators can create safe physical environments by arranging the room in a way that allows for easy entrance and exit, or provides safe spaces for students to go to when they need to calm down. Educators can also create safe, social, emotional environments by teaching and practicing respectful communication and demonstrating their value of relationships. Sticking to consistent schedules and preparing students for any changes in routine with as much advance notice as possible can help. Consistency and predictability are key to helping people feel safe, especially if they have experienced trauma. Stay aware of cultural factors and how they may impact a person's perception of trauma, safety, privacy, and help seeking. It's important to develop a trauma lens. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with you?" ask, "What has happened to you?" The aim here is to shift the focus from the individual themselves to the event or experience. This type of thinking is also applicable to how staff consider interacting with parents and caregivers as well. Parents and caregivers also are likely to have a trauma history and may be struggling with their own emotional or behavioral difficulties as a result. Not every behavior or emotion is caused or explained by trauma, but any possible trauma needs to be considered. Best practices for responding to individuals experiencing trauma-related distress include active listening, validation of feelings, and providing resources for support. This video demonstrates some good ideas.
When I'm having a bad day, I would like my teacher to go tell me calm down. Like we have this corner in our class where you can just play with stuff till you calm down. So I would ask her if I could go over there. That makes me feel relaxed.
kind of the prototype of the teacher that would make students go to them more is a really good attitude. Also, knowing students by their name, I noticed is something like students really like. When they feel that the teacher has a personal relationship with them, students are more likely to talk to them. Also, the good attitude, just having someone feel like there's someone that they can talk to all the time about anything is a really good thing, because students tend to get overwhelmed or stressed, and just having someone that you can go to is really helpful.
Like a calm teacher, a teacher that's like really close with everybody, and like ask how your day is on a daily if they can. Like a teacher like that.
If I'm ever upset in school, one thing that I think teachers can do that makes me feel a lot better is just to maybe talk to me. It's always good if they ask first if I want to talk about it, because some days I don't always feel like talking about my emotions if I'm upset or sad or angry. But it's always great to just talk to a teacher, even if they're just listening to what I'm saying and not commenting. It's nice to let out some things.
Two of the most important things you can do are listen and believe someone if they start to disclose a trauma history to you. They might not have had anyone who let them tell their story, or who said, "I believe you," or even, "I'm sorry that that happened to you." Be mindful of the language you are using so as not to accidentally pass judgment or invalidate what the person may be experiencing or telling you. As Maya Angelou said, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." That's a great stance to take when we think about taking a trauma-informed approach. We appreciate your efforts throughout this segment of the training. Whether this was new learning or revisiting information you've learned in the past, please take a moment to reflect and identify any key takeaways from this segment that will help you support student mental health.